a choice right now, between fear and love. It's just a ride.
Out of the dark night of ignorance and into the shining light of truth.
Expanding reality.
A population of citizens capable of critical thinking.
We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are.
There's a level of reality where everything dissolves into an ocean of energy.
We empower our experience by insisting on our authenticity.
That's very profound. Very.
Expanding reality.
Welcome to Expanding Reality. I am your host, Brandon Thomas. On this episode, I got to sit down with Richard Rokeby. He wrote the book, The Lights Upon the Hills, the Burton-Dassett UFO Events of 1923. Now, this is a crazy cool story, guys, and we go really, really deep on this one as far as different theories about UFOs, entities, poltergeist activity. There's Civil War battles of ancient England in there. It's really cool. There's a incredible church. I mean, it's got everything, guys. So check it out. Of course, all the ways to find Richard and his amazing book are linked down in the show notes. This is a truly awesome episode and a very fun story. So, you guys, without any further ado, Richard Rokeby. All right, everybody out there in the listening world, we have the honor of having Richard Rokeby on the program today. Richard, how are you today, buddy?
I'm very good, Brandon. Thank you ever so much for inviting me on.
Absolutely, and we actually have done this before. We were just talking about it a little bit beforehand. I just had some studio issues earlier on in the days here, and I was just so fascinated by you and your story, and of course your wonderful book, that I wanted to have you back on. So thank you so much for being so gracious and understanding. And he was so sweet, guys. He just said, absolutely, I completely understand. I'll be back on anytime. So thank you, first of all.
No, it's a pleasure. No problem. I'm always happy to talk.
Cool. Well, for my audience that doesn't know too much about you, let's just tell us a little bit about yourself, my friend.
Okay, so yeah, I'm Richard Rokeby. I'm an author and a researcher, and I've sort of specialised in UFO sightings, I suppose, for my last book. But I do like to think I look at a sort of broader theatre of interest. So I look at what could be termed as forbidden knowledge or forbidden history, alternative history. So I have a wide range of interests, but I suppose it's ufology that's always sort of stayed with me over the years.
So cool. And yes, your book, The Lights Upon the Hills, is something I was fascinated by, man. Philip Mantle reached out because you're under Flying Disc Press, along with the Kinsella Boys and a handful of other incredible authors, man. Trey Hudson, of course. And all you guys are just wonderful, man. Your stories are fascinating. You guys are incredibly well-spoken, and you're just a joy to experience in life. So thanks again for your time. So about your book, what inspired you to write this thing?
So I suppose the story found me, really. I moved. I was a police officer in London. I've remained a police officer, but moved up to the Midlands of England. And when I first moved to Warwickshire, which is where I'm based, I thought I'll do a bit of research around the local history. And I picked up a couple of books. And one of the books was called The Ghosts of Warwickshire by a really respected local historian called Betty Smith. And I had a look through that book, and I'm not that interested in ghosts. I don't think they have their place, but to me, it was more to do with the history and seeing what stories were out there. And within that ghost book, there was the normal stories of, devil dogs and phantom monks and grey ladies. But one story really sort of stood out to me, and it was this account of lights on Burton-Dassett Hills. I read it. It was only a very short chapter, 2 or 3 pages, and I just felt there was more to that story. But also, with my interest in ufology, what I felt was this wasn't a ghost sighting. It was actually a really well witnessed UFO or UAP event, and I just felt it deserved a deep dive into it to find out what the story was. And it's fair to say I found out. What I found was amazing, and there was far more to it than first was projected in that one chapter.
Absolutely. And in your book, you talk about the Warwickshire history. I mean, you really do a deep dive on this and this account, this sighting, and I'd like to get into it. So tell us about the sighting. Are you specifically talking about the winter of 1923?
Yeah, yes, 1923. It sort of reached a bit of a peak. It sort of started December 1922. Those sort of sightings, and it started with local people seeing lights on the hills, which is where the title of the book comes from, and describing these lights as white, reddy, bluish, small orbs. Sometimes on their own, sometimes in groups, moving at different speeds and altitudes, but all centered really on Burton Dasset. And Burton Dasset it's now a country park. It's not very big. It's probably less than a mile square, but there's a rich history there. So there's an Iron Age fort there, where there's graves from an old Iron Age settlement there. It was a marketplace or market area during the sort of Middle Ages, and the reason for that is it's quite prominent. So Warwickshire is generally very flat and rolling countryside. So for your American and worldwide listeners, if they want, imagine Hobbiton out of Lord of the Rings from the films, and they see those green rolling hills, that's very much what Warwickshire is like, the countryside. But out of nowhere rise these series of 5 to 6 hills in quite a distinct pattern, rise out to the landscape, and that is Burton Dasset Hill. So it was easy to be seen around the countryside, hence it was used as a sort of market area. And following the market came a small town. There was a small Saxon church there that, for reasons I'm sure we'll cover later on, was given quite a big investment and became very significant for the area. But then the Black Death took its toll, and a series of sort of evil landlords, for want of a better word, who were overtaxing the local populace, meant that it was deserted. So it then became an area for, from about the mid 1700s, where people would just go to relax on a Sunday, or walk the hills. But in December, around about December 1922, these reports start coming in of the lights, and people were going up there to see if they could see them. And in the book, I detail around about 8 good accounts, solid, good eyewitness accounts. But there was probably hundreds of people that saw these lights, and it came to a sort of fever pitch, as you said, Brandon, around about February 1923, when the local newspapers started getting involved and started turning up and writing stories about it. So that's when it sort of came to its peak, and it became a national sensation, because newspapers from London and Birmingham were sending people up to sort of view these lights.
Yeah, and when you talk about the flap of the 1922, 1923 from December to February, that was a real tight little spot, but there's a lot that happened in there, including George White's account. So in your book, you detail how he felt it when it flew over, and he was with 2 companions. So it suggests something tangible, or something that can interact with at least our sense of touch.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I read the accounts. So my accounts are based on newspaper articles and Betty Smith's book, but certainly from the newspaper article from the Banbury Gazette. George White, who's a local carpenter, works on the estate. He's heard about these lights and is probably a bit cynical, so decides with his couple of friends, he's going to go up onto the hills, take field glasses or binoculars, to see if they see these lights. And all 3 of the party do see the lights and the objects. But as you said there, what he just says is, he says to the paper, I felt them go over me. And I thought the use of that word was really, really interesting. Oh yeah. And that, because that suggests some sort of downward pressure, some sort of change in the atmospherics. And as you said, it suggests a physical presence rather than just an illusion or lights moving around, or what was later attributed to the lights, which was the ufologists' nemesis, which is marsh gas, which is put forward so often for these sort of things. But from what George White was saying is, no, he felt something go over him, which suggests something tangible, if not a craft, then something more tangible, certainly.
Yeah, at least an entity, something, right? Something that would affect the atmosphere, as you said.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think, and I think there was a number of sightings on that time, but people were going up the hills to see the lights and then reporting back that they'd seen them. And it's worth saying, around that time, they were being attributed to ghosts or spectres. And that's very much of its time, I think, because spiritualism had a bit of a renaissance. I don't know if you or your listeners know this, but spiritualism really took off after the American Civil War, and then was brought over to the United Kingdom shortly after the end of the American Civil War by two sisters who had sort of toured America and then were brought to London, and they would give performances, and it really introduced spiritualism in its modern form to the United Kingdom. It had a bit of a sort of interest at that time, but following, the deaths that came out of not only the First World War but the Spanish flu, of course, people felt that through spiritualism they could reconnect with their lost sons and daughters, and it was a bit of a known practice throughout the country, not just in Warwickshire, for people on a Sunday, if there was reports of some lights, which wasn't that common at all, but occasionally the reports of some lights, people would go up and see if they could see the ghosts, for want of a better word, on the hills. And that's really how it was interpreted at the time. And that is completely understandable. It is completely understandable that people would want that corroboration around spirits, because I think, well, if spirits can exist there, my son that was killed in the First World War might be out there somewhere, and we can reconnect. But I just think if you look through it, the modern lens, orbs of light, changing colours, moving, exerting downward pressure, moving in, people in the report said they seem to be searching for something. There's a report of it illuminating a whole house, which means directing, vast amount of energy and light into a fairly focused point. That is not the traditional form that ghosts take. And, looking at it through what we know now, it seems to be more like a mass UAP event.
It does. And it's interesting what you said about the U.S. giving spiritualism to the U.K. So I'm grateful that we could influence you guys on something positive, and not just something like reality TV. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of things. There's lots of things you can influence us on, including the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which happens to be my team. So, and did rather well this year. So there's lots of positive things coming from the States.
Yeah, and another way to cook food instead of boiling everything.
That's right. If we can't boil it, let's griddle it.
That's right. I'm in the South. We just fry it. Everything.
Yeah.
Well, I do like the UAP connection. And what's interesting about this too is it seems to be a very visual phenomenon, and the presence of either spirit or a small UFO or UAP, because they can take many forms. It might not be a nuts and bolts craft, that could still be considered a UAP or a UFO event. It just could be something a little bit less conventional than we're used to seeing. And so whenever we talk about it illuminating an entire house, well, it must have wanted to see something there and needed visual light to achieve it. Now, what's interesting on this is two levels in my mind. Is that number one, it's a visual thing. It's almost like a scouting drone or something like that. And even though it doesn't take a physical form that you can view, it might just be a small little, piece of technology that's completely illuminated. And that we can't rule out either because we haven't been able to really study these things, right? And the way that they behave and perform is very interesting as well. But also, I find it interesting that if it is a spirit or a super high technology or something like that, what's the need for the illumination? Is that a byproduct of their existence or the technology that powers the craft? Or is that something that's necessary for them to see, like we do? Do they take in their surroundings via, light waves as we do, photons hitting a receptor? It's interesting. It just makes me ask a lot of questions.
No, I mean, it's a really good point. Certainly from the descriptions we get from 1923, to me, there are sentient objects. I think there's a discussion to have about whether they're nuts and bolts craft, but they certainly are interacting with their community, and I do think they have a purpose. And it could be something to do with the iron ore. I offer a hypothesis in my book that it could be the setup of the hills, because the three prominent hills that face sort of the western direction. So out from the west, there was nothing really until you get to the sort of Black Mountains of Wales, and the Malvern Hills, which are of a similar height. So these three hills for this area of the country is quite prominent, so there's a hypothesis that I've detailed in the book about whether actually Magpie Hill, Windmill Hill, and Beacon Hill are set out in a sort of, they're in a line of three with one slightly offset. In February, the three stars of Orion's belt are directly above it, and these sightings, reached a fever pitch in February. It could be coincidence, but I think the whole thing with Burton Dasset is you've got these elements that if they were on their own, you would say, well, that could be coincidence. So if there was light seen on some hills, okay, that could be explained. But then if you've got a church in that area that has really unusual paintings and carvings, that's something else. Then if you've got three hills that just happen to be in the shape of Orion's belt, and in February, Orion is standing directly above them, well, now you're starting to get somewhere. And then finally, what else do we need? Well, we need a military base. And there's a military base literally a stone's throw away from these hills, all in an area which is the size probably in the States of an average park. It is a small, relatively small area. So once you get all those elements in, I think it's telling us a really interesting story about that area.
I completely agree. Those are the elements, and you're right. You check all the boxes, because even and the military base is sometimes overlooked. So this is why I know you're a great researcher, is because you asked that specific question right there. So let me ask you then about the hills, because something you said about the Orion connection is very interesting. So do they align damn near perfectly, like the spacing and everything, to the three stars in Orion, the three predominant stars in Orion's belt?
Yeah, so if you look at a map on the floor, you'll see that there is Magpie Hill, Windmill Hill, and then just off to the right is Beacon Hill. Magpie Hill and Windmill Hill are the two bigger hills. Beacon Hill is the smaller one. If you lay down flat, a bit like we have in the Great Pyramids there, although there is some argument that you can reverse that and it's like a mirror image, you still get two large and one small slightly off to the side. Then if you look at Orion, you get the two large stars and the Mintaka, which is the smallest one, slightly off from the line. So you do get this sort of image played down in the hills. Now I'm not saying that's definitely the reason, but what I'm saying is there's another interesting fact that through my research, because I do like to get out into the ground and get boots on the ground, and I went out with a friend on a number of occasions in February just to understand the area myself, and we set off very late at night, 11 o'clock at night, walking up the hill in February, with red head torches on, so we didn't ruin our night vision, going up the shrub leading up to the hills. And as I looked up, it was just striking. I was fortunate to have a clear night in the middle of what was a fairly stormy sort of time of year, and you could see Orion just as if his perch stood on the hills, and the three lines of the three dots of the Orion's belt uncannily match these three dots of the three prominent hills in Burton Dasset. And another interesting fact, I was on another radio show, and it was pointed out to me that actually the Pleiades play a big part in Orion and its significance as well. So, there's maybe some work to do. Well, if Orion Belt matches up with these three hills, where would Pleiades be? Where would Sirius be? How far do you take it?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. And the fact that they line up so clearly and with all the anomalous activity that goes on there, it makes me think that, is there any evidence to suggest that they could possibly be man-made, but from an ancient culture?
Yeah, no, that is a really good point. Not something I've looked into. I don't think so. I think the geography of the place would suggest it's pretty much iron ore sediment. The ironworks were a major part of Burton Dasset. I said there was an Iron Age village there before anything, and then there was iron ore still being collected right up till the end of the First World War. So the iron, which of course in its rawest form does have magnetic properties as well, may well have some influence on what drew these lights in. And I think that's why people make the link perhaps between these lights and the Hesseldalen lights, because I think that the sort of growing theory around that is that actually the lights are somehow caused by the geography of the area, and it's maybe being produced underground and then manifesting itself into the air. I do think the Hesseldalen lights are a bit more natural. They seem to, from what I've seen, they seem to appear fairly quickly on a fairly straight path and then disappear. But I'm told that there's other ones that move around. Whereas I think the lights from Burton Dasset do seem to be under more sentient control, do seem to have a purpose, whatever that purpose is, I guess.
And it makes you think of, if this is a natural phenomenon, a couple of things. Number one, if it's there's underground aquifers that could result in some piezoelectric phenomena above ground, as the water recedes, or even like crop circles I know are affected by the rise and recedence of water underground. So perhaps there are areas of this phenomenon that occur naturally as far as them manifesting as lights or orbs, but it's a completely natural phenomena, not under sentient control, like you said. But the lights that are under sentient control could be doing what other UAP witnesses have reported, which is changing shape to mimic a local phenomena in the area as to not draw as much attention to themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is it some sort of camouflage? Is it a byproduct of something else? Going on. From my time as a police officer, you always want to ask the question. The big question is motive. Why? Why? And that is the big gap, isn't it, when it comes to ufology? As I said, we see all these fantastic things. How many? It goes back to the old quote: "How much evidence do people want?" Because when you look at the reports, it's difficult to deny. And we've had the Nimitz and the Roosevelt encounters now, but no one's really asking the question why. And that is the big question: why are these craft moving around? Why were these lights here? And that is the real difficult thing. And I've put forward a hypothesis. People can then read it and sit and see what they think. But we don't know why any of these lights are. There's lots of and craft and UAPs and UFOs moving around, and the abduction phenomenon and all that sort of things that are going on. The big question is why? What is the big picture? Why are these things happening? And that's what makes it so interesting and fascinating, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And an interesting question that I think everybody who looks into this phenomena should be asking ourselves is, would we be okay if it's just simply study? Like if it's just that we're whales or, dolphins or gorillas or something to them that they just study and interact with only on the level of research. Like, are we going to be okay if that's the answer?
Yeah, I mean that is a good point. Do we have a choice? I suppose. Do we really have any influence on it? I mean, I'm I'm very much of the nuts and bolts camp. I think we need to get. I think there's a place for this spirit, perhaps more spiritualist side of it, the interdimensional side of it, without a doubt, and people make some really good cases around that. But for me, I think how you're really going to influence change, how you're really going to get people to sit up and notice, is through nuts and bolts craft, is through the sort of film that's now been released. That does make people, rightly or wrongly, that does make the general public and the government sit up and take notice. So I think that's really what we've got to try and focus on. And I'm hopeful, we will get that, that killer piece of evidence, sometime soon.
Yeah, and it seems to be parceled out in a way that's appeasing but not revealing. It's in my mind, man, the more that I look at it, I think the governments know exactly what's going on. I think that they know absolutely what it is. There's some massive secrets that people have been led to believe, and as far as the cover-up of what's really going on in our whole reality, I think there's a lot of our reality that seems very, very stable that's probably not, and that they know that, and it's all pretty much connected. And back to what you said about the interdimensional phenomena, I love that one as well, because I think nuts and bolts is interesting, and I'm not ruling it out. I guess the best thing about all of the theories of what UAPs or UFOs are is all of them could be entirely possible at the same time. They don't need
Yes, that's right. Yeah. There's no... you're dead right. I don't think there's a single answer, is there? It'll be like everything. Life is generally more complicated than you give it credit for, and I don't think there'll be a single answer. It'll be a mixture of things once if and when we finally know.
I hope it's all of them. I hope it is things coming from other planets. I hope it is interdimensional beings also. I hope it's inner Earth. I hope it's, future humans coming back in time machines. I hope everything that we think.
Well, that is a really good point. They're not mutually exclusive, are they? And I'm doing some research around currently around UFO sightings. Predominantly in the UK, but also in America from the 1950s, and there is something that says to me that the number of sightings, some of them might be human technology that have been a bit like we've got now, where we're wondering if the Tic Tacs are actually Chinese drones or whatever. That I think maybe that in the 50s, some of those sightings were actually human or advanced civilization based,
or like the Foo Fighters or something like that.
Well, possibly, the Foo Fighters. So there's theories coming on now about whether the Foo Fighters were in fact a foreign power's weapon. I'm not so sure about that one, but whether some of the sightings around UFOs were from advanced craft or advanced civilizations. But going back to your point, I think. There is, I think it reached a peak around about 1958 or something like, maybe a bit later, maybe 1962, where the United Kingdom National Archives held all the sightings, and it suddenly drops off 62. We've had all these sightings through the 50s, and then suddenly it starts to drop off. Now, when you look at the number of sightings that there is, just for sort of 1958 alone, there's, thousands. All them sightings can't be attributed to one thing. Some of the things you mentioned there, some of them might be human technology, some of them might be interdimensional, some of them might be alien craft, some of them, could be our future selves. And I do think that is maybe the way forward with it all, rather than paint them all with the same brush.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it'd be more fun, right? I mean, just intellectually, it'd be way more fun if all of these things were true at the same time. And, it's interesting what you said about the flaps, because, yes, they went from, the Kenneth Arnold to the Roswell to the flyover of the Capitol, or the Capitol building. And they kind of progress in that way, but real Art Deco and even the crafts evolve over time, like their visual appearance, what they look like. It kind of changes with the psychology of everybody here. And so that was our pre-space flight era. And that's when, the first widely reported flaps were occurring. And then you go into kind of like you said, a break after 58, but in 61, of course, with Betty and Barney Hill, now you're talking about the abduction phenomena really ramping up. And then all the way up to the Pascagoula incident in the 70s. I mean, there's some incredible ways that the phenomena has progressed that's been very interesting. But I think also, though, like you said about the light specifically, that and how there's different locations that's either these are reported. You think about like Marfa or the Min Min lights in Australia, and it's this area of where this specific type of activity occurs, and it's very, very interesting. Now, back to the Foo Fighters, I like attempting to connect the dots on all these crazy theories, right? It's just one of the fun parts about it, because a lot of times you can find that. Sometimes it's all really speculative because you have to kind of go into the story or the idea that it's true in the first place, right? So if you think about the stories of Operation High Jump and of Admiral Byrd going down to Antarctica, and about the Nazis creating this huge base down there, New Schwabenland, and then about the reports of the battle that took place there with high technology that was Nazi craft, looking at something like the and then leading, of course, onto the secret space programs and breakaway civilizations and all that. You kind of can then look at the Foo Fighters as if, maybe that was a Nazi or a foreign power technology that was already in use, and it was just so ahead technologically that we couldn't fathom it to be anything man-made at all. It had to be described as an undescribable phenomena,
Yeah, yes, I think there's certainly something in that, and it could of course be Third Reich technology that was doing the Foo Fighters. I think I think an idea was put forward of releasing something like them in order to mess with radar, etc. But I think the reports from the Foo Fighters, and it's not just Western Europe, of course, they're reported in the Japanese Pacific theatre of war as well. But they don't seem to be causing much harm. So if they are being released as an anti-aircraft type weapon, they're pretty ineffective, to be honest, because I think a lot of the reports are just saying that they seem to be circulating the craft or following the craft and then dissipating off. There's no real reports that I can see where it says it's messing with instruments or we have to turn back or, different from the Iranian experience in I think it was 76, where the 2 Iranian fighters went up over Tehran to confront 2 UFOs and their weapons wouldn't work.
Yes.
With the Foo Fighters, it tends to be more passive. But they are up there. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned Operation High Jump, which again is something I've read into, and I've just read recently that the only time in history that the America and the USSR worked together on nuclear testing was in 1958 in the Antarctic, which just seems a really strange thing, doesn't it?
It is. And the story, I think this is Operation Fishbowl, right?
Right, yes, it could be, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so what they were doing down there is shooting nukes up in the sky to see if they could break what they call, why it was called Operation Fishbowl was because of the theory that like a flat Earth and a
right, yes, the dome
and a firmament above us, right? And so they were attempting to break through this thing. Now, what's interesting is reports say that they launched a rocket up 13,000 feet and it exploded on impact, meaning that it hit something translucent and it destroyed itself. And so how much and it's stories like that and it's reports like that, man, that trip me the hell out, because yes, it is monumental that the USSR and the Americans were working together, and especially right after High Jump, you're talking about right after the Cold War. I mean, right after it. And we're down there blasting off nukes like we're a couple of kids shooting bottle rockets in the front yard. And it's interesting how that plays out, but then also it lends to the idea again that all of it could be a deception. We could be, Richard, you ready for this? We could be living on a flat plane. Are you prepared to wrap your mind around that?
I would say no, if I'm honest.
Have you looked into it at all?
No, I just think I've travelled quite widely. I could see how it would work. So once, the bits I understand, I think I could see how it could work in terms of it being a disc. And that was interesting how the illustration I saw had effectively Antarctica, which is massive. I mean, that's another massive mystery, by the way, isn't it? Which it could be a continent in itself that has slipped down through the crust's moving, the Earth's crust moving. And I saw an illustration where it had that around the whole of the sort of what would be Earth's disk. And I thought, that could actually work, because it would feel the same like being on a sphere. But I just think the way that physics matches up, the way that satellites have to be set, I think it would have been known by now if that was the case. But again, I was reading together about the hollow Earth theory, and there was a rocketeer in Germany in around about 1909, so similar to the site, not too far away from the sightings at Burton Dasset, and he was given funding by the Munich sort of Institute for Science to build a rocket. But he wanted to fire the rocket from Munich into New Zealand through the centre of the Earth, and they said, "Well, we're not sure about that. Let's just see if you can fly it up in the air first." And he took that funding, and it didn't go that well. But his original business plan, if you like, was, well, I want to fly a rocket through the centre of the Earth, and we'll pop out in New Zealand.
Wow. Yeah, it checks out, right?
Yeah, it could do, but people were willing to say, well, yeah, you could try that next, but initially just see if you can get it to fly up in the air.
Yeah, baby steps, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Let's start here, buddy. Okay, well, let's talk about the church, man. And I'm interested. I want to hear what you have to say about the church, and also I'm curious about ley lines and stuff like that. So go ahead and tell us about this awesome church that you found.
Yeah, so they're within Burton Dasset Hill. So as I said, it's a relatively small area, but there is this unusual church in as much as the size of it. So it's often called the Cathedral in the Cotswolds or the Cathedral in the Hills. And All Saints Church started off as a fairly small Saxon nave, and then seemed to, probably about the time that the markets was popular and the wool trade was taking off, so Middle Ages in England, it seems to have a major investment. And the church is a size where it's in the hills, but it's in a dip in the hills, so it's not as if you can see it from the bottom of the hill. It's not particularly in a predominant place. So it is in a bit of a strange place, and for its size, you would have thought people had shown up. So the location is interesting, but the church itself, I describe it when you first go in as sparse but expansive. So you walk into it, and it does feel like you're in a huge space, not quite the size of a cathedral, but certainly a bigger than normal church. And above the archway where you first go to on the northern door, there are carved into the archway small orbs, like a series of orbs, which again is quite unusual for a church. Normally you get some sort of pattern or perhaps religious inscription. This had orbs around the inside of the northern door, and then as you walk in, you're sort of met by these columns. So there's columns both sides, but on the northern side, the columns are engraved, and they have these really strange and beautiful carvings. Now, the northern side of the church was always perceived as the evil side of a church. So any gargoyles or anything that would be used to ward away evil spirits were on the northern side. And it just so happens that the northern side of the church does face towards the hill. So again, is that coincidence, or is it being cited for that reason? But the carvings show a number of different pictures and illustrations and scenes. So one of the carvings is of the Green Man, which the Green Man is an ancient English symbol, which is not it's not uncommon in churches. It does appear in churches, but it's still quite rare. And the idea behind that was the pagan man, which is the Green Man is half man, half oak tree and vegetables and grass, and he's made of organic matter but in the shape of a man, and you could take it all the way back to Roman times, I guess, if you pushed it. But the Christian church used to use it to symbolize the joining together of two religions. So the earth, the oak tree, would be the pagan side of it, and the man would be Jesus and Christianity. So it was used to illustrate that joining of two religions. So that's in the church, but there is something else that would suggest perhaps it's actually the joining of two worlds. Was it carved there? All the artwork and the carvings come from the 14th century. They were all sort of done about the same time, about the church, the time the church was expanded. And then there's other carvings that show strange hybrid creatures half men, half sort of dragon or lizard type creatures. And my favourite is there is a country scene where a dog is chasing a hare, or a small rabbit, and dasset. The word dasset is Old English for the hunt, but on part of that carving, there's also animals that are upside down. So they've been carved upside down, so as if they're being levitated up into the air. They're upside down, and I just think that's absolutely fascinating. So, it fits into this area, this strange and beautiful area about why have those carvings which are relatively rare in English churches, just particularly on this site.
And it's interesting that they do depict them upside down because, now you're thinking about abduction phenomena and mutilation, cattle mutilations. In the U.S., we have those reports. And that's kind of the iconic, UFO hovering above, a beam of light comes down and then, tractor beams this thing up to its craft to go do with it whatever it wants. Again, it could be part of a study or something like that. But it's also interesting that that you interpret it as being depicted that way in the church. I think that's really, really cool. Now, when was the church built again? About what time?
The church originally dates from, it was certainly there in Saxon times, and it was recorded in the Domesday Survey of 1086. And the church was made bigger in the 13th century, but the carvings and the paintings date from around the 14th century. So really, really quite a long way back.
Yeah, and all before that Civil War battle, the English Civil War battle of October 23rd of 1642 that you talk about in your book. So
yes, that's right. Yeah, so Edge Hill isn't too far away. There was a Battle of Edge Hill, which was the first real time that royalist forces and parliamentary forces met up for a battle. It wasn't too far away, and it was a bit of a score draw. And both sides limped away. And actually, if it had been settled there, we probably wouldn't have had another five years of the English Civil War. But they were sort of evenly matched. And the local legend is that Oliver Cromwell, who was the leader of the parliamentarians, actually sat out the battle in Burton Dasset. You would get a good view of Edge Hill from there. So that was around about the mid 17th century, 16th century.
And this is why when you talk about the light phenomena, it's another thing that could be, like you said, a spirit or a ghost apparition. I mean, we can't rule anything out on this, right? And so with this though, what I'm reminded of is like Gettysburg over here in the States from the Civil War, and it's still a very, very haunted place as far as there seems to be some sort of like paranormal time loop that everything's on. And there are certain predictable moments where certain predictable things occur, and you'll hear gunfire and you'll hear men screaming and stuff like that. And so whenever major energy disruptions occur, such as a war, a very bloody battle or something like that, it could create some sort of rift in whatever this reality is that then replays the event or manifests it in lights in some way or something like that. I mean, it's got to be considered.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think there is something about people's heightened emotions when murder scenes, etc., or places of quite big disasters. That is a terrifying thing for a human being, and their emotions are literally going through the top of their heads. And I do think there is, a good argument for that being captured in space and time, captured in buildings. Something like the Battle of Edge Hill, where there hadn't been a serious battle in England, probably from Baden Hill in the 9th century, or perhaps even before then. It was still relatively, for its time, it was quite a major event, and it was at the peak of its technology as well. So obviously firearms are being used, cannons are being used, and the soldiers that went through that were experiencing something up until that point no one had ever done in the United Kingdom or in England. And their emotions, you can imagine the fear, the trepidation, the horror, all those emotions. When it's on such a large scale, I think there was around about 15,000 people took part in that battle. It's got to be captured. As soon as you've gone to sports stadiums, you can sort of sense the crowds that have been in there before. It all adds to the atmosphere. And I think there is certainly something in it. And, the Battle of Edge Hill is said to replay out around about Christmas time every few years, and they can hear the firing of cannons and the crying of horses and the screams of men dying. And that is often reported.
And whenever you do come across places of high energy like you're talking about like that, yes, there is a massive impact on it. So in my mind also, there's no coincidences. So the fact that this phenomena visually, the lights there, the possible animal abductions depicted in the church and the engravings, as well as the all the other phenomena associated with the area since a long time before. It seems like the church, with its conception, could have been put there on purpose, which leads me to my point. So perhaps people are drawn to certain areas. There are certain shaman and geo-surveyors that will go out in ancient cultures and survey an area and get spoken to either via some sort of psychedelic alteration to their senses, and so they're more tapped in their belief system, or they go out and survey an area with certain instruments, like a certain magical stick or something like that. The point is that they will find the perfect spot, and how they determine this, they say, is based on the energies. So there is, when we talk about ley lines in an energy grid across our planet that could exist and that people can measure with either science or with these ancient practices, it says to the idea that these places are put here on purpose in these specific locations to either magnify or utilize the whatever energies exist there. Now, and those could play a massive variety of impacts on those in that area and witnessing or attending those church services, right? Just like when you talk about Delphi and stuff like that, where there were gases that were being secreted by the mountain that made people trip balls. And so, yes, you are going to have a religious experience, but it was built there on purpose for that reason, to utilize the natural energies of the earth. This one was just a little bit more scientifically verifiable, right? So with this idea, though, you think about the battle then occurring in that location, and you think, well, were the armies led to that specific spot to meet at that specific time to feed into the energy of that area? Or were they just drawn there, or was it just a big coincidence? I think with things like this, especially in an area of high strangeness, then you kind of can lead to these conclusions because it's not off the table. Again, none of it's off the table, right?
Yeah, that's right, and that is a good point. I mean, the two sides in the English Civil War weren't looking for each other. Actually, they were both heading down to London from northern strongholds, and just happened to pick the same route. They could have gone anywhere. One could have gone east, one could have gone west, but actually they both took west. Both circled around the sort of Midlands, would have been Birmingham, Coventry, and happened to meet up at the Edge Hill, and they sort of clashed into each other. And you make a good point, Brandon, about energy sucking people into certain places. That certainly seemed one. No one was looking for each other. They wanted to avoid a battle if they could, but they sort of clashed into each other. So yeah, that is a really good theory.
Yeah, and it's just with these areas like this, man, it's fascinating. And then I'm reminded, of The Meadow, of course, Trey Hudson's book, and how the phenomena out there kind of occurs in the same way. There's lights, there's all sorts of interesting things out there. And it's just, again, it's fascinating, man. It's fun to think about. I'm grateful that you wrote this book. I'm grateful that you're doing the research. We'll probably wrap it up here in just a little bit. Was there anything else about it that you wanted to talk about?
Well, just briefly, the paintings. So I think there's pictures in the book about the paintings, but there is some beautiful 14th century medieval paintings in the church, and it pictures the Virgin Mary and Saint Michael. But there is two kings that I think are really interesting, and I'll leave a teaser for your audience, Brandon, by just saying I think one of the kings there is telling a really interesting story about visitations from the past, and I hope people enjoyed reading about it.
Richard with the cliffhanger. Nice job, man. You guys make sure to check out the book linked in the show notes for all the ways to find Richard as well as his book. Fantastic story, incredibly well written, man. Like I said, I'm grateful. You sent me an e-copy of the book and I'm grateful for it. It's a wonderful read. It's very well done and it's a fascinating story. So you guys make sure to go down in the show notes and check that out for all the ways to find him. Richard, thank you so much for your time, man. I really do appreciate you, my friend.
No, that's brilliant. Always very nice to speak to you, Brandon. Best of luck to you for the future.
A massive thanks to Richard Rokeby for coming by and talking about all this amazing stuff, guys. Of course, go down in the show description and check the link to find his book under Flying Disc Press, and just enjoy the whimsy that way, guys. He's a phenomenal author and a really, really cool dude. So thank you again, Richard, for your time and your knowledge, man. So all the ways to find this show, guys, is expandingrealitypodcast.com. That is where the links to all of the socials will be, the YouTube, the Patreon, all the good stuff is there. Go on out into your week this week and pick up a piece of litter, get out of the left-hand lane, make sure that you keep a couple of extra bottles of water on you to pass out for folks. It's a little warm out there. And then also just go out into your world, guys. Enjoy the whimsy, take a look around for some strange lights and see if it could be related to the phenomena that we just talked about here. And while you're doing all of that, just be good to one another. Y'all, thank y'all so much for listening. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.